When I was 19, my family moved 2 states away without telling me, and I woke up to an empty house and a note that said, "You'll figure it out." I still remember the silence more than the words. The refrigerator hummed. The morning light spilled across the floor where their boxes had been the night before. Every room carried the shape of people who had chosen to disappear. No goodbye. No warning. No explanation. They left me with a locked bank account, unpaid bills, and a life I had never been taught to build. I stood in that doorway holding a piece of paper like it was proof I had been erased. They thought abandonment would break me. 10 years later, they returned expecting the same lost kid. They didn't recognize the person who opened the door. My name is Daniel Mercer, and before that morning, I was the son who always adjusted. The one who stayed quiet when arguments filled the house. The one who remembered birthdays, fixed broken things, and convinced himself that being needed meant being loved. My parents never said I was a burden, but they never made me feel like a priority either. My father was always chasing the next opportunity, the next paycheck, the next reason he was too busy. My mother learned to survive by avoiding conflict, even when avoiding it meant leaving me alone inside it. I grew up believing patience was the same thing as strength. At 19, I was old enough for them to expect independence, but still young enough to need guidance. They used that gap to disappear. They told themselves I would adapt because I always had. What they never understood was that every time they overlooked me, they were teaching me something. I learned how to make decisions without approval. I learned how to build without support. I learned how to stop waiting for people who had already walked away. For years, they saw me as the kid they left behind. They never imagined I would become someone they couldn't control. The first time I saw my parents again, they stood on my doorstep like they were visiting a house they had never abandoned. My mother looked around before she looked at me. Her eyes moved across the walls, the furniture, the life I had built. There was a brief pause, the kind people make when they realize something is bigger than they expected. Then she smiled. "You've done well," she said, almost surprised. Not proud, surprised. My father stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He ran his fingers along the edge of my kitchen counter and nodded like he was inspecting a place he had helped create. "I always knew you'd figure things out," he said. The sentence landed softly, but I felt the weight behind it. The same words from the note. 10 years later, dressed up as praise. They asked about my career, my house, my success. They didn't ask about the nights I spent choosing between rent and groceries. They didn't ask about the birthdays I spent alone or the years I waited for a phone call that never came. My mother kept saying, "We're proud of you." But every time she said it, I noticed the same thing. She was proud of the result, not the struggle that created it. I listened to them talk for 3 evenings before I understood something important. They hadn't come back because they finally understood what they had done. They came back because they saw what I had become. My father asked if I could help him with a business idea. My mother mentioned how nice it would be to feel like a family again. They spoke about the future as if the past was a chapter everyone had agreed to close. But I was the only one who had lived through every page. The turning point came when my mother found an old photograph on my bookshelf. It was from before they left. She held it quietly and said, "You were always such a strong kid." I looked at that picture and saw someone who wasn't strong. I saw someone who had been forced to survive. That night, I sat alone in my office, looking at the life I had built piece by piece. The company I started, the home I earned, the peace I created without their help. For years, I thought revenge meant making them feel the pain they caused me. Then I realized something better. They wanted access to the person I became. They didn't get that privilege. The next morning, I made a decision that changed everything. I stopped trying to prove I was worth staying for. I accepted that they had already made their choice. Now I would make mine. I didn't slam the door on them. That would have been easy. Instead, I did what I had learned to do over the past decade. I prepared. I reviewed every conversation, every request, every quiet assumption they had made since returning. I stopped reacting emotionally and started paying attention. The same people who once disappeared without explanation were now slowly trying to insert themselves into a life they had abandoned. But this time, I had boundaries. I had built my career around understanding details. Contracts, negotiations, risk assessments. I knew how small decisions could create lasting consequences. I didn't need revenge that looked dramatic. I needed a decision that protected everything I had built. I separated my personal life from my professional world. I updated agreements. I secured my finances. I made sure my future depended on no one's promises. When my father asked about opportunities, I gave him polite answers instead of open doors. When my mother asked why I seemed distant, I told her the truth without anger. I learned how to live without you. The silence afterward said more than any argument could have. They expected the abandoned teenager they left behind. They met a man who had spent 10 years becoming impossible to abandon. The moment they realized they had lost control of the situation was almost impossible to notice. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no final speech that changed everything, just a quiet conversation at my dining table. My father placed a folder in front of me, explaining the opportunity he wanted me to invest in. 10 years ago, I would have searched his face for approval before answering. I would have wanted to believe this was the moment he finally chose me. Instead, I looked at the papers. Then I looked at him. "I can't be the person who saves you from the consequences of your choices," I said. He stopped talking. My mother looked down at her hands. For the first time since they returned, neither of them had an answer. I didn't reject them out of anger. I didn't punish them with cruelty. I simply refused to carry what was never mine. Over the following months, the distance grew naturally. The calls became less frequent. The invitations stopped coming. They realized the version of me they remembered no longer existed. The strange thing was, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. The revenge wasn't watching them leave. The revenge was knowing that when they walked away this time, I didn't lose anything. People around me noticed the change before I ever explained it. My friends, the ones who had watched me rebuild my life from nothing, understood why I kept my distance. They never asked why I wasn't celebrating my parents' return. They had seen the years it took for me to stop measuring my worth by who stayed. Some relatives weren't as understanding. They called me cold. They said I should be grateful my parents came back. They believed forgiveness meant giving someone the same place they once had. I listened quietly, because they only saw the reunion. They never saw the empty house. They never saw the 19-year-old sitting on a bedroom floor, wondering if he mattered enough for someone to come back. My reputation didn't suffer the way they expected. The people who truly knew me respected the boundaries I created. They saw that protecting my peace wasn't bitterness. It was maturity. The hardest part wasn't losing my parents a second time. It was accepting that I had spent years hoping for an apology from people who were more comfortable remembering the past than facing it. And maybe that is why the story matters. Because sometimes the people who hurt us don't come back to repair the damage. Sometimes they come back to see if they still have access to what we built without them. For a long time, I believed the ending I wanted was the one where they finally understood my pain. I imagined an apology that explained everything. I imagined my father admitting he was wrong, and my mother admitting she should have protected me. But peace didn't come from hearing those words. It came from realizing I no longer needed them. My life continued quietly after they left again. I kept building my company, spending time with people who showed up consistently, and creating the kind of home I once wished I had. The biggest change was inside me. I stopped seeing myself as the person they abandoned. I started seeing myself as the person who survived. Years later, I still have the old note they left behind. Not because it hurts anymore, but because it reminds me of the distance between who I was and who I became. You'll figure it out. They meant it as a dismissal. I turned it into a promise. I did figure it out. I figured out how to stand alone, how to choose myself, how to forgive without reopening the door. My parents gave me an empty house, but I built a full life. And the greatest revenge was never making them regret leaving me. It was becoming someone who no longer needed them to come back.